Hello and welcome to today's Knox Together Founders Day program. I'm Megan Clayton of Alumni Engagement and the 50-Year Club. Today it is my pleasure to introduce Owen Muelder. Owen graduated from Knox in 1963 and went on to earn his master's from Miami University, Ohio. As many of you know, Owen served as an administrator at Knox for 36 years before he retired in 2004. His passion and his interest in the anti-slavery movement and the Underground Railroad soon had him back at Knox as the director of the Knox College Underground Railroad Center in July of that year. He's the author of two books, The Underground Railroad in Western Illinois, a book that Manisha Sinha, University of Connecticut historian, calls a must-read for all those interested in the abolitionist underground, and Theodore DW Weld in the American Anti-Slavery Society, which University of Texas historian Lewis Gould calls a work that deserves the widest possible readership for its extensive research and compelling insights. Owen has delivered speeches at international, national, and regional conferences, and has had articles published on 19th century American history in scholarly journals. With that, I welcome Owen and his presentation of the anti-slavery movement, the Underground Railroad, and Knox College.
Thank you, Megan, for that introduction. And I'm pleased to be making this presentation today, celebrating Knox College's 185th birthday as part of this year's Founders Day events. What I want to do today is divide my remarks into three parts. The first part will be a general description of the anti-slavery movement in the United States before the Civil War. And the second part will be a general discussion of the Underground Railroad. And thirdly, I will connect those two to the third part, which will be a discussion of Knox College's relationship to both the anti-slavery movement and the Underground Railroad. Well, let me begin by saying this. In United States history, the first era of reform, first efforts to address things that people thought could be improved in our country, occurs in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s. And there were a number of these reforms. There was the temperance movement, which of course eventually leads to the Prohibition Amendment in the 20th century. There's the women's rights movement, which really takes hold in the 1840s. But in addition, there's the establishment of peace societies. There's efforts to address reforms of prisons in the United States and what were then called insane asylums. Also, of course, efforts to improve the rights of sailors on the high seas, and of course, the anti-slavery movement. Many of the people who were part of these reforms took their inspiration from the opening line of the United States Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. And indeed, many of these people during this era actually called themselves perfectionists. I don't have a lot of time to talk about the early efforts of anti-slavery crusaders today, but I should mention that even in the late 18th century and early 19th century, there were individuals and organizations that were trying to bring about the end of slavery in the United States. Some of the more important individuals were Benjamin Lundy and Isaac Hopper, Thomas Paine, and also Lucretia Mott, Phyllis Wheatley, David Walker, and others. And the most important organization, I'd say, during that era were the Quakers, the Society of Friends. But what I really want to then zero in on today is when the anti-slavery movement became nationally and regionally organized in a way that it never had been before in American history. So as the anti-slavery movement really begins to cohere, these are some important things that were unfolding. First of all, in December of 1833, The American Anti-Slavery Society is established in Philadelphia in December of that year. Its national offices were shortly thereafter moved to Manhattan. The Constitution of the society maintained that slavery in the United States should end immediately. The American Anti-Slavery Society from the beginning rejected the idea of using violence in any way as a means to emancipating slaves. So they initially turned to what they called an effort of moral suasion that they thought could work through publications, newspapers, anti-slavery journals, anti-slavery almanacs. There was even a children's anti-slavery magazine that they published. They also, of course, had to organize themselves in such a way that they could raise money to run the organization. They hired, at least initially, a few agents or lecturers who traveled throughout northern states, organizing state anti-slavery societies and local anti-slavery societies, local auxiliaries. Most of the leaders of this movement were devout Christians. They believed that Protestant ministers at that time were critically important to shaping public opinion. A large percentage of these religious leaders at that time had attached themselves to what was then called the Second Great Awakening, sometimes called the Great Revival. This Second Great Awakening theology rejected Calvinism, which was then very dominant as a Protestant theology. The Second Great Awakening essentially said that the Calvinists had gotten it backwards. Calvinism, well, in a nutshell, essentially, in my view at least, was a very, very harsh theology. It maintained that most individuals, even from the time they were born, were it was predestination that they would not be allowed to gain the Lord's salvation after they died. Calvinism said that human beings were so inherently sinful, so inherently evil, that they weren't worthy of the Lord's salvation. The Second Great Awakening said, no, that's completely wrong. And this was very intoxicating to people who were not, particularly in rural areas, attached to any church or regularly even went to church on a Sunday. As a result, this is what they were inspired by. The Second Great Awakening ministers said that you needed to essentially do three things. You needed to repent. You needed to genuinely embrace Christianity. And in addition, you had to demonstrate that you really meant that in terms of how you led your life, delivering good works to others. First slide, please. The most important leader of this revivalist movement was a man by the name of Charles G. Finney. Finney was a powerful speaker, a charismatic personality who delivered fire and brimstone sermons. Sometimes I would say even frightening sermons. And they usually lasted for hours. Audiences were oftentimes overwhelmed by these lectures, sermons that Finney delivered, and left people in many cases reporting that they had felt very anxious by his deliveries. Finney's popularity spread through upstate New York, where this movement started, and he started to be surrounded by a group of young men spreading the same message. This group was called Finney's Holy Band. I should say here parenthetically that Finney eventually becomes president of Oberlin College, the most important anti-slavery institution of higher learning in the United States before the Civil War, Oberlin College in Ohio. These evangelical abolitionists then said the following: everyone would be worthy of entering the gates of heaven after they died. And when they said everybody, They met everybody, including slaves. Okay. In addition, I should at least say this, that there were also many other abolitionists who believed that slavery violated the very principles of our Constitution, liberty and justice and freedom for all. And of course, there were those who believed that slavery was simply a moral wrong. Second slide, please. A second individual that I should mention, who was an especially effective member of the American Anti-Slavery Society, was Theodore DW Weld. During the 1830s, particularly into the mid-1830s, Weld was responsible for recruiting more agents to the society. The American Anti-Slavery Society decided by the mid-1830s that its efforts of publications weren't as effective as the lecturers they had hired. So they asked Weld, along with help from Henry B. Stanton and the poet John Greenleaf Whittier, to recruit more agents. But Weld was primarily responsible for this recruitment, and these people he recruited came to be called Weld 70. I'd like to have more time to talk about the work of the American Anti-Slavery Society, but again, time requires me to take us up to 1840, when unfortunately the American Anti-Slavery Society split apart. It split apart for a number of reasons. One was that there was division over whether or not women should have leadership positions in the movement. About half of the society said no, they couldn't tolerate that. And so they split apart, and one group remained with the American Anti-Slavery Society that included women's leadership. Another organization formed and called itself the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society. The society also split apart at that time, however, because many in the movement, certainly not all, but many decided that if the anti-slavery movement was really going to take hold, it needed to move in a political direction. Others said, no, no, let's not get involved with the political party, the slippery slope of politics. So that was another reason for this split. There was also the desire of local societies increasingly to say, look, we want to spend our money, we want our efforts put in more locally and not sending our funds to a national society. And also I should mention that at that time, increasingly, there were a number of Black abolitionists, people like Samuel Cornish and Henry Highland Garnett, who believed that it was very, very important for violence to be used if it was necessary to bring about emancipation. Their position was essentially as it's very easy for white abolitionists to talk about not using violence. If you're a person who's a slave, you might not necessarily look at it that way. Even Frederick Douglass says by the late 1840s, he had initially adopted an anti-violence position that perhaps violence was going to be necessary to bring about an end of slavery in the United States. In fact, I should say at this point, here's what happens after 1840. The abolitionist movement does take a political turn. In 1840, the Liberty Party is established. They run a man by the name of Birney for president. In 1844, they run him for president again. And their focus was only on the anti-slavery message. In 1848, the Free Soil Party is established. It's a vastly expanded version of the anti-slavery movement. Free Soilers were anti-slavery, but they said that if they were going to move forward politically, they were going to have to include other issues, other political issues of the day to their campaign agenda. And of course, as many of you know, by the time you get to the mid-1850s, the Republican Party is established. And of course, it's made up of former Liberty Party members, people who were part of the Free Soil Party, but also many Northern Democrats, scores of Northern Whigs, and also individuals who, at least for a time, had been part of what was in the 1850s known as the Know Nothing Party. Okay, next slide, please. Before I conclude this first part of my presentation on the anti-slavery movement, I should briefly discuss, as part of this Founders Day celebration, how critically important George Washington Gale, Knox College's founder, how important Gale was to both the Second Great Awakening on the one hand and to the abolitionist movement as well. It was Gale in 1821 who converted Charles G. Finney to the movement. Here's this most important central figure to the movement, Finney. And who converts him? It's Gale. In addition, it was Gale who enrolled Theodore DW Weld, who I just discussed, to the movement in the late 1820s when Weld was attending the Oneida Institute, the school that Gale had started in upstate New York before he came to Illinois. So keep in mind then, when you're thinking of Knox College's history, that it's Gale who is the mentor of these two giants of the movement, Finney and Weld. And of course, this is significant because Finney and Weld skillfully weaved together both this new evangelical Second Great Awakening religious advocacy with anti-slavery advocacy. Believe me, the Second Great Awakening and the message it was delivering was therefore not well received in Southern states. Let me remind you, of course, as many of you probably know, Gale starts the Oneida Institute in upstate New York. Next slide, please. Which combined the idea of students going to class and getting classroom training and instruction. But as a manual labor school, the students were required to do all the work to run the school, tend the fields, work in the carpenter shop, prepare the food, do all the work that was necessary to run the school. And finally, let me say this. It's very important to know this, I think, in terms of the history of the anti-slavery movement. The first anti-slavery society of any kind established in the entire state of New York is established by students at Gale's Oneida Institute in 1833. Okay, now let me turn to the Underground Railroad. You know, I think I'll just begin by saying that when you study this subject, it's fascinating to come upon the remarkable number of deceptive actions, ruses used by Underground Railroad agents to help people escape. And of course, there are a number of them. So I'll tell you one that is particularly interesting and popular, really, among scholars. And it's the story of Henry Brown. Henry Brown worked in a tobacco factory in Richmond, Virginia. And one day he comes back to his home and discovers that his wife and children have been sold away. Brown goes through today what psychologists would call the stages of anger and depression and so on. And he finally decides he's without his family. He'll take the risk of trying to escape slavery. He gets a hold of an address of a man in Philadelphia by the name of James McKim. McKim was one of these anti-slavery agents that I was referring to earlier. He gets the address. He has a letter sent to this address telling McKim that a box is going to be arriving eventually at his office. Brown, with the help of two friends, builds a box, has holes driven into the top of it. They hand Brown water. They put him in the box. They address the box to McKim. They nail the box down, and they take Brown to a railroad station in Richmond and mail him to Philadelphia. 27 hours in that box. There's this remarkable sketch in a number of anti-slavery books showing crowbars being used to pry Brown out of the box. He emerges. You should know that Brown goes on to be a rather famous figure in the North. He eventually moves to England. He's afraid he might be captured and returned to slavery. where he delivers anti-slavery lectures, and in many cases does a kind of demonstration, a kind of act showing his experience. Well, let me go on to say this. The Underground Railroad is a general description of the various ways enslaved Americans fled bondage, aided by both Americans of European descent and Americans of African descent. Some Underground Railroad operators were very active, involved with this work frequently and for long periods of their life. There was a second group of individuals who you could call Underground Railroad operators, but they were less frequently involved, but nonetheless took part in this activity. There was a third group of individuals who are not Underground Railroad operators, but individuals who simply had a situation thrust upon them. Somebody knocked at their door at 11 o'clock at night. There stood a slave woman with her 2 children. What were you going to do? Were you going to help these people or not? I should also say, and this is important to know, I think, many fugitive slaves escaped on their own. They were suspicious of anybody who might turn them in. So they managed, frankly, to escape by means of their own wit, guile, and sheer determination. In many cases, that took their escape longer. It took them much longer to feel genuinely free. Finally, I want to mention this, and many people don't know this either. There were also what were called maroon communities. Maroon communities where fugitive slaves escaped into a remote area of a slave state. They didn't leave the slave state, but they moved into little communities where other escapees joined together and survived. A couple of the most prominent were the Great Dismal Swamp along the North Carolina, South Carolina border, as well as in Florida, where many fugitive slaves fled into the Seminole Nation, and many of them actually became part of the Seminole Native American nation. Well, next I want to talk about the directions that fugitives took. Fugitive slaves escaped out of the South in every direction. Many of them moved through Arkansas into Texas and eventually into Mexico, even as far west as California. Some fugitive slaves got on seagoing vessels that headed into the islands of the Caribbean Sea or up the East Coast towards New York and New England. Of course, those of us who live in Illinois and in northern states are aware of the fact that many freedom seekers headed north towards freedom in Canada. And of course, some fugitive slaves remained in free states, even though this was very risky because they were always vulnerable, perhaps, to being recaptured and returned to bondage. Well, what strategies did fugitive slaves use when they were fleeing? Next slide, please. It was incredibly important to know how to find the North Star on a clear night. When I was a boy, I can remember my father going out in the backyard with my sister and my friends, and we would look at the stars and he would talk about the constellations. Today, we live in a society where people, I think, spend more time on their cell phone than doing something like that. But in any case, in the 19th century, fugitive slaves knew how to find Polaris, the North Star, the last bright star on the Little Dipper. Next slide, the one having to do with creeks and rivers and streams. It was very, very important also, if you were fleeing slavery, to perhaps come upon, particularly in Illinois and Iowa, but other parts of the North as well, to come upon a creek or a stream or a river. And if you moved against the current, if you moved against the flow of the water, you would be heading northward. Fugitive slaves also could try to travel through the water or the edges of the water to break their scent. They also used turpentine, onion, or pepper on the bottoms of their feet to try to break their scent as well. Another important advantage, particularly again in Illinois and Iowa, but also some parts of Ohio, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, was traveling through tall grass prairies. The tallest prairie grass in the world that grew in Illinois and Iowa was big blue stem. It's the tallest prairie grass in the world. And by the time you got into the middle of the summer, fugitives could literally disappear into these tall ranges of grass. Some summers 6.5 feet tall. And the deeper you got into the summer, the taller it got. Another advantage was that these belts of timber would run up against, or excuse me, the prairies would occasionally run up against belts of timber that were oftentimes on slightly higher ground. And that would allow fugitives to disappear into the woods, look back over the prairie grass to see if they were being pursued. And I think we have a slide then that you can see the prairie grass. There were 3 enormous belts of prairie grass, by the way, in Western Illinois: the Carthage Prairie, the Bushnell Prairie, and the enormous Hancock Prairie that started down in Adams County and close to Quincy, moved up through Western Illinois towards Macomb and Monmouth and Galesburg and Geneseo, Canton, all the way over to Peoria and the Illinois River. Another important thing to know about strategies that escapees employed was the timing of when to leave. Of course, escaping immediately after dark was important. It was also useful sometimes to escape on a Sunday, because sometimes enslaved people were given the opportunity to have a little more time off on a Sunday. And particularly crucial and helpful was escaping on a holiday, Christmas, even New Year's, the 4th of July, the birthday party of a slaveholder's child, when again, the routine of the day was different and your escape might not be noticed until later. Of course, freedom seekers, for the most part, traveled on foot. They occasionally found a boat or a raft that could help them escape. Many of them would take, that is appropriate, if you want to say it that way, a mule or a horse from a farmer's barn. Of course, they could be, if given aid by an Underground Railroad operator, hidden in a wagon. And sometimes they were even disguised and traveled in a farmer's rig. That was not as frequent, but it occurred. Escapees also did not move in straight lines. Don't think of the Underground Railroad as a straight line, okay? It zigzagged and it backtracked. And sometimes it moved like a U-turn in order to confuse pursuers who were tracking them down. The kinds of things that Underground Railroad operators thought about when they were conducting their business would be as follows. 1, as I mentioned, transporting a fugitive in a wagon or a rig. It was incredibly important that they provided food or clothing, and as well as shelter, particularly when it was cold, but shelter, of course, to be hidden and not discovered. Most fugitives left literally only with the clothes on their back and very little food that they could carry. They were sometimes hidden on an Underground Railroad operator's property for just a little while before they moved on. Other times they would stay hidden for days with an operator before the coast was clear. Another important feature was that Underground Railroad operators, of course, could give directions, alert fugitives to the importance of certain geographical features of the landscape that would help them escape and be hidden. And of course, it was also the case that on many occasions, Underground Railroad operators actually moved with a fugitive or fugitives to the next underground railroad operator along the route of the flight. I should also talk about some of the basics that underground railroad operators had to be aware of. First of all, you should know or remember perhaps from your history lessons that there were two fugitive slave laws passed that were federal laws, one in 1793 signed by George Washington after Congress passed it, and a stronger version of the fugitive slave laws passed as part of the Compromise of 1850 that made it illegal for anyone to help enslaved people escape. Operators carried out their work in secret. They usually only talked to close family members or comrades about what they were up to. They never discussed what they were involved with strangers. And though some of their children were aware of what they were up to, the details of those operations were usually not discussed with children who might slip and say something to the wrong person. They also, of course, sometimes coordinated their activity with other Underground Railroad operators in their area. They would either occasionally meet with them or sometimes at an anti-slavery movement, anti-slavery meeting, discuss strategies on how they could help each other. And this is also important to know. Women were crucial to this Underground Railroad operation because women were frequently less noticed, were not kept their eye on as much by people who are watching Underground Railroad operators. You've got to remember that Underground Railroad operators were considered by most people as troublemakers. There were very few abolitionists in the United States before the Civil War, but it was a much smaller percentage of Americans who actually involved themselves with the Underground Railroad. Okay. The next thing that I want to talk about is ways that enslaved people learned about the Underground Railroad. You're an enslaved person. You're on a plantation or a farm, attached to any kind of slave labor. And for the most part, you had not been away from where you were held in bondage. So how did they know about this? Well, there were 2 or 3 ways that this happened. Basically, if you were an enslaved person held on a plantation or a farm, work was divided into 2 parts: field slaves, or work that had to be conducted outside, or house slaves. House slaves, in many ways, being a slave in any way was a daily nightmare, of course, but house slaves at least could usually be in a house where it was warmer in the winter. They had access to more food. And in many ways, their presence wasn't quite invisible, but they were around their slave owners so much that they were carrying out the work they were required to do. And they were moving around the house, and they might come upon a newspaper, and that they were supposed to be cleaning up that room, and simply slip the newspaper underneath their clothing, take it back to slave quarters. And though most slaves were intentionally not allowed to learn how to read or write, some could, and they would read in these newspapers aloud to other enslaved people these stories in the newspaper about legal cases being carried out against anti-slavery operators, about Underground Railroad operators. These newspaper stories referred specifically to towns and communities and even individuals by name. Of course, a second factor was that some freedom seekers who were captured and returned to bondage would discuss their experience while they were escaping, what it had been like, what they had learned. And thirdly, and this is a wonderful irony, many times enslaved people learned about the Underground Railroad and anti-slavery communities from the slaveholders themselves. Sunday afternoon after church, a slave owner and his family had other families over for dinner. a so-called house slave was delivering the food or bringing drinks to the veranda in the afternoon. And slave owners would be saying, those darn Underground Railroad operators in Quincy or Galesburg, Illinois, or Princeton, Illinois, would mention the towns, mention the names. So that's how some enslaved people who did escape learned of aid they might receive along the way. Okay. The next thing I want to do is conclude my remarks with a discussion of what Knox College's relationship was to the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad. So let me begin by just simply making this clear. Knox College, from the time it was founded, almost immediately established itself as the most noted Underground Railroad community in downstate Illinois. There were other important abolitionist communities: Jacksonville, Illinois, Quincy, Princeton, Ottawa, and so on, Farmington, Illinois. But Galesburg's reputation as both an abolitionist community and as an Underground Railroad location was really the most prominent in downstate Illinois. Chicago was, of course, eventually the most important. And this is something that nearly every historian who's studied the Underground Railroad in Illinois believes was true. 35 years after the Civil War is over, Booker T. Washington gives a speech in Galesburg where he refers to our town as, quote, a garret station on the old Underground Railway. On Independence Day, 1837, the year that the college and the town are established, the founders of Galesburg established the Galesburg Anti-Slavery Society. Later that year, in October, the Illinois State Anti-Slavery Society is established. 40 members of the Galesburg community supported the call for the establishment of a state society. In 1839, in Galesburg, a youth anti-slavery society is established. Get the children on the right side. In 1840, as I mentioned earlier, the Liberty Party is established in Illinois. 6 members of the Knox College Board of Trustees held leadership positions in the state society. In 1841, the State Anti-Slavery Society held its annual meeting in Galesburg. In 1843, Knox College President Hiram Kellogg, next slide, please. Kellogg leaves Galesburg, travels to London to take part in the meeting of the World Anti-Slavery Society. And later in 1843, in Galesburg, a female anti-slavery society is established. And a year later, in 1844, Galesburg's Female Anti-Slavery Society and the Peoria Female Anti-Slavery Society are the primary leaders in establish successfully a state female anti-slavery society. Next slide, please. In 1848, the Free Soil Party is established, as I mentioned earlier, and Jonathan Blanchard, the second president of Knox College, is nominated as an elector to the Electoral College for the Liberty Party. And of course, finally, as I think most Knox folks know, in October of 1858, the 5th Lincoln-Douglas debate takes place in Galesburg. And this is the debate where overwhelmingly Lincoln scholars say Lincoln really found his legs and had his first really effective debate. Lincoln knew that Galesburg and Knox was this abolitionist community. And for the first time with emphasis, he publicly brings up the immorality of slavery. He had mentioned immorality of slavery as a kind of an aside at the first debate in Ottawa. But he really hits that theme in Galesburg. At one point, he turns half to Douglas, half to the audience and says, "You're blowing out the moral lights around us." Well, of course, I also then want to talk today a little bit about Galesburg, Knox College, and the Underground Railroad. Galesburg's reputation, as I said moments ago then, is really sealed as this really important downstate center, Midwestern center of Underground Railroad activity. In 1917, Grace Humphreys writes her Centennial History of Illinois, where she actually writes in that book, when she gets to the activity of the Underground Railroad, that Galesburg was a place where fugitives, quote, were safe on the streets. I've never come across an account of a fugitive making it into Galesburg and being returned to bondage. In 1896, highly regarded member of the Knox College faculty, early promoter of public schools in Galesburg, George Churchill, wrote in a letter to Underground Railroad scholar Wilbur Siebert that, quote, the old First Church of Galesburg was used as a sort of railroad station where passengers were not easily seen, end quote. In 1843, George Washington Gale is indicted for aiding the escape of a fugitive slave. In 1842 and 43, a fugitive by the name of Susan escapes from Southern Illinois, because in Southern Illinois, there were counties that tolerated slavery. She and another woman by the name of Hannah and her 3 children make it as far as outside Knoxville. They're captured in Elba Township. They're taken to the jail in Knoxville. Knoxville was then the county seat. Her slave, so-called slave owner, a man by the name of Borders, comes to get her. The abolitionists in Galesburg challenge him and say, they come over to Knoxville and say, he has no proof. He has to rather go back to Southern Illinois. In those days, that took a while. She is eventually released from jail, and so are her children, on the condition that they won't flee. While all the legal wrangling is being worked out, she opens a laundry, starts doing work in Knoxville, doing a laundry for people, finally gets her own place to live in. And shortly after that, Borders comes back, is able to get a posse. The children are captured. Abolitionists in Galesburg hear this is going on. They go to Knoxville, put her in a sleigh in early November, and get her to safety in Galesburg, but she never sees those children again. She lives with a man by the name of Van Aller for a while. Van Allen, Van Aller, we're not sure. But she eventually marries a man by the name of Richardson. She comes to be known as Susan Aunt Suki Richardson, a very prominent figure in Galesburg, buried in Hope Cemetery. And she herself was involved in the Underground Railroad operations of the town. In 1847, George Davis, who for years was treasurer at Knox College, addressed a gathering celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Congregational Church in Galesburg. In that speech, part of that speech, he delivers in detail an account of 2 Quakers arriving at his home on what he called a beautiful October day and asking him for help because these Quakers knew of Galesburg as an Underground Railroad town. Davis reports that he got the aid of 2 friends, got a wagon, and was able to take the fugitive to safety in Stark County, northeast of Galesburg. And finally, Megan, if you could go to a slide on Samuel G. Wright. I want to conclude talking about Wright because he's a hero of mine. Samuel G. Wright, there's Blanchard, there's Wright. Samuel G. Wright was a Knox trustee who George Washington Gale sent out into Western Illinois as a missionary. He settles in Stark County, and Wright starts keeping this remarkable diary that's over in the Knox Seymour Library archives. Wright's diary is considered by Underground Railroad scholars throughout the United States as one of the best piece of original firsthand primary source material that you'll find anywhere in the country. And Wright's diary is, of course, wonderful to read on many levels. He talks about harsh winter storms, losing a wagon in the Spoon River, losing a wheel off of a wagon in the Spoon River one day, delivering sermons. But every so often he wrote down these firsthand accounts of helping freedom seekers escape. I'll read two brief ones to you. February 6, 1843. On Friday, another fugitive from slavery came along, making 21 that have passed through this settlement. June 6, 1848, carried a fugitive to Osceola and preached at 4:30. Well, let me conclude my presentation today with this. Knox College was a Western anchor of the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad, one of the most important chapters in our nation's history. All of us who are connected to Knox, as alums, students, members of the faculty, members of the board of trustees, staff, parents, people who make donations and contributions to the college, all of us who have a connection to Knox, I hope will occasionally take time to stop and consider the fact that our school played a central role in what was the first integrated social movement in American history. We can all take great pride in that. Thank you for listening to my presentation today. Hail Knox.